He arrived like a breeze, unnoticed by the wind, wrapped in a smile, armed with a camera. A man of fair skin, well-worn leather shoes that had not seen the dust of Sahel, and a press badge clipped to his chest like an entry pass to truth. At Wagadugu International Airport, he spoke French with the confidence of someone born beneath Haussmann's boulevards. His name was Julien Morel. His mission, he claimed, was to understand Africa's heartbeat. But in a land where the soil remembers colonial boots and every shadow whispers of resistance, Burkina Faso had learned to listen carefully. What Morel said, what all men like him said, was one thing. What they did in silence, behind the lens, behind the wire, was another. He told the customs officials he was a freelance journalist. No agency, no assignment letter, just a backpack and big dreams. He praised President Ibrahim Traoré's bold leadership, said it was rare to see young African leaders stand up to Western pressure. He bought tea in local markets, snapped photos of goats and sunsets, handed out pens to village schoolchildren. To the eye, he was harmless. But the lens he carried did not just capture Burkina Faso's beauty, it calculated it. If this message resonates with you, take a second to like this video. It helps more people see it. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This story belongs to all of us. Morel didn't stay in hotels where diplomats drank cocktails under slow-spinning fans. He chose a modest guest house on the edge of Wagadugu. Quiet, functional, forgettable. At night, the staff heard no music, no TV, no laughter. Only the clicks of a keyboard and the murmur of encrypted calls bouncing from one server to another, far outside the continent. By day, he traveled. Not to monuments or ministries, but to places reporters rarely went, military-adjacent zones, rail yards, mine roads. He stayed long enough to be noticed, but short enough not to raise alarms. He spoke to guards with the charm of a storyteller. He asked about shipment times, transport routes, fuel depots, wrapped his curiosity in journalistic innocence. When one soldier laughed and said, "You ask more questions than our commander," Morel smiled and replied, "That's how journalists learn." But Burkina Faso was no longer asleep. Under President Ibrahim Traoré, a former captain turned revolutionary, the nation had shifted its posture, head held higher, eyes open wider. Since taking power, Traoré had walked a perilous line between vision and vengeance, youth and tradition, progress and resistance. He had no illusions about the games being played in Africa. The West had changed its language, but not its intent. The scramble was quieter now, more sophisticated. Cameras instead of rifles. Consultants instead of colonels. Soft power with sharp claws. In the quiet corridors of the country's intelligence service, Morel's movements triggered alerts. Not alarms, just interest. The man who claimed to write for European media had no bylines, no published pieces, no visible collaborators. Yet he visited strategic infrastructure with peculiar frequency. His camera often pointed just a bit too low. His questions just a bit too pointed. So they watched him. Without touching his phone, they cloned his SIM. They traced his connections, mapped his emails. What they found was not the anatomy of a documentary. It was the blueprint of espionage. Coordinates. Unusual patterns. A contact in Abidjan known for laundering surveillance through humanitarian fronts. Messages flagged with phrases like asset placement, security blind spot, and low visibility at Palace Westgate. Still, Traoré didn't move to arrest him. That would have been too easy. He waited. He let the man breathe, believing his cover held. And then, as calmly as a conductor raises a baton, the president ordered a press conference. No fanfare. No CNN. No BBC. Just local journalists, handpicked, invited quietly. And one addition made at the very last minute, Mr. Julien Morel. He walked in with the same confidence that had gotten him through customs. Beige trousers. White shirt. No tripod. No crew. Just his press badge, a notebook, and a shoulder bag full of calculated lies. He greeted guards at the gate like they were old friends. "I'm here for the president's press briefing," he said. They nodded. But their eyes, just like their country, were no longer naive. Inside, 6 chairs were set in a half-circle. A microphone stood at the center. No smiles. No press kits. No welcome drinks. Just silence. Julien sat down, opened his notebook, scanned the room. No one greeted him. The room felt too still. He told himself it was the usual African formality. Maybe they were just nervous around a European journalist. Then the door opened. President Ibrahim Traoré stepped in, not in a tailored suit, but in military fatigues. No papers. No spokesperson. No speechwriter. Just a man who had fought in the bush, eaten dust, buried brothers, and now carried a nation on his back. He walked with the presence of someone who understood what was at stake, not just today, but always. Julian stood and extended his hand. "Mr. President, it's an honor. I was hoping." Traoré gripped his hand firmly. "You've been asking many questions about us, Mr. Morel," he said. "Today, I will answer them. But first, I have a few of my own." Julian blinked. A nervous smile flickered. He adjusted his collar, tried to hide the sweat beginning to rise on his skin. "Of course," he said. "That's what interviews are for." But this was not an interview. This was a reckoning. President Traoré turned to a nearby soldier. A folder was handed to him, thick, sealed, ominous. He placed it on the table with quiet authority. "You have been in our country for 23 days, the president began. "Yes, Mr. President," Julian replied, steadying his voice. "I've been gathering stories, filming locals, trying to understand." "Understand what?" Traoré asked without blinking. "The challenges your people face. Security, infrastructure, foreign relations." The president nodded slowly. He opened the folder. "You have visited 9 military-adjacent zones," he said. "You have filmed 3 sensitive installations under the guise of interviews. And you have sent encrypted data to servers in Abidjan. Do you deny this?" Julian's face drained of color. I'm a journalist," he stammered. "That's what we do. We go where the stories are." Traoré took a step forward. "And is it also normal," he said quietly, "for journalists to send classified field maps of oil routes and supply lines to known foreign intelligence assets?" One of the local journalists gasped. A soldier stepped forward holding printed photographs, images of Julian by restricted towers, his laptop screen aglow with maps, email timestamps matching surveillance logs. Julian looked at the evidence, then at the room. Eyes stared back. Cold. Unforgiving. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. "Subscribe and share this if you believe the time for Africa to rise is now." President Traoré turned toward the cameras. "This man says he came to understand our people," he said. "But in truth, he came to map our weak points, to trace our veins and prepare the blade." He held up one final paper, an intercepted message from Morel's account. "Palace security thin near Westgate. Movements predictable. Viable for future asset placement." Julian began to tremble. "No, that's not. It's fake," he whispered. "It was sent at 2:17 a.m. from your room in Zone 3, Traoré replied. "We don't forge evidence, Mr. Morel. We collect it." Silence fell like a stone. Traoré looked directly into the lens. "You came for stories. Now you are the story." 2 guards stepped forward. Julian didn't resist. He walked out the same door he entered, this time without his camera. He was inside the frame now. Captured. Not with handcuffs or bullets. With truth. If you're still watching, leave a comment below. Do you call this journalism or betrayal? We want to hear from you. The sun was beginning to fall behind the walls of the presidential compound, bleeding gold across the low sky, but inside the press room, time had fractured. Julian Morel's chair sat empty. The cameras were still rolling, and President Ibrahim Traoré stood silent, steady, letting the weight of the moment settle into the bones of the room. 6 journalists remained. Local. Grounded. Their pens had stopped moving. Some looked down, others stared straight ahead, as if trying to remember everything exactly as it happened, because they knew this was no ordinary day. This was the day Africa turned the lens. If you believe history is being made, let others see it. Share this now with someone who needs to hear it. One of the soldiers returned with a second folder, thinner, darker. Inside was Julian's laptop. It had been quietly confiscated the night before by agents in the shadows, while he had slept in ignorance. No broken doors. No confrontations. Just intelligence, quiet, deliberate, relentless. Traoré gestured to the projection screen. "Let us show you something," he said to the room. The lights dimmed, and then the wall came alive. A map appeared, real-time, intricate, a digital rendering of Burkina Faso dotted with red pins. Routes. Extraction points. Oil pipelines. 2 unmarked military storage depots circled in red. The data was exhaustive, accurate, and classified. The title of the folder: "For Review, Côte d'Ivoire Client." Gasps spread through the room like wildfire. Not dramatic ones. The kind of quiet inhalations people make when they realize something has shifted beneath their feet. Julian's digital fingerprints were everywhere. From metadata trails to message headers, his work was not that of a journalist. It was an intelligence operative's wet dream. President Traoré did not yell. He didn't need to. "Explain this," he said earlier. But Julian had not answered. He couldn't. There was nothing left to say. And even now, in his absence, his silence echoed louder than any denial. Back outside the palace, word was spreading fast. By the time dusk had turned to evening, the first video clip, just 40 seconds long, hit social media. It showed Traoré standing calm, composed, delivering the now iconic line, "You came for stories. Now you are the story." Within an hour, the footage had reached WhatsApp groups in Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, and beyond. On TikTok, a student in Accra reposted it with a caption, "This is how you protect your people. No noise, just truth." Another video came soon after, showing the projected map, the sealed folder, and the stunned silence of the press room. And then came the photo, a pale-faced Julian Morel being quietly escorted down the hallway, his camera bag now dangling like a dead weight. Across Burkina Faso, cafes turned off music and played the press conference instead. In tea stalls, men sat with arms folded, phones propped against ceramic cups, watching in silence. In homes, entire families gathered around radios, straining to hear every word. On national television, the footage aired again and again. One man shouted from his balcony in Wagadugu, "He caught a spy live on TV." A grandmother near Kaya whispered, "This is the president we prayed for." And far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, something larger was beginning to shift. In Paris, the reaction was colder, controlled. The French Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a brief statement that evening. "We are aware of the situation involving one of our citizens and expect fair treatment in accordance with international norms." But they said nothing of the maps, nothing of the emails, nothing of the encrypted files or the contact in Abidjan. Because they couldn't. The evidence wasn't just strong, it was undeniable. Back inside the intelligence compound near Tangan, Julian Morel was no longer playing the role of a storyteller. He was under formal arrest, not for being a journalist, but for unauthorized surveillance, national security breaches, and intent to compromise state infrastructure. His rights were acknowledged. He requested access to the French embassy. Traoré's response was issued not through back channels, but straight to the people. "We have a bigger case to answer, and it belongs to Africa. If you stand for sovereignty over silence, hit subscribe and keep this story alive. The world needs to know what's really happening here." But Traoré knew the moment wasn't about punishment. It was about power. About reclaiming the right to tell their own story, on their own terms. No embassies were stormed. No chaos broke out. No mobs. No screaming headlines. Just a continent, watching. In Ségou, Mali, university students spray-painted the wall of an abandoned colonial building with a message, "We see you now." In Ghana, an artist posted a digital portrait of Traoré, draped in the Burkina Faso flag, with the caption, "He didn't raise his voice. He raised the standard." In Dakar, a group of Pan-Africanists held a silent march through the city center, holding posters that simply read, "This is what leadership looks like." And in Abidjan, where Morel's digital trail had led, the embassy went silent. Their security posture shifted. Files were encrypted. Visas were rechecked. The world had felt the tremor. Traoré made no follow-up speech. For 3 days, he said nothing to the press. No tweets. No statements. He let the evidence breathe. Because sometimes silence is not absence, it's strategy. But on the fourth day, the silence broke, not with a podium, but with a gathering. The president walked out of the palace, not into the press room, but into a school courtyard on the outskirts of Wagadugu. No staging. No cameras, except those held by the people. Children sat cross-legged in front. Farmers stood at the back. Drivers, traders, students, teachers, and even a few soldiers in uniform. He stood in the sun, sweat soaking through his fatigues. No teleprompter. No security barrier. Just words. They came not like thunder, but like rain on dry earth. They have been watching us for years, he said. Not to help us. To control us. To measure our wounds. To shape our thinking. To whisper over our shoulder what we should say, and what we should never dream. He paused. People leaned in. They sent one man with a camera. But it was not a camera, it was a weapon. A weapon pointed at our future. Gasps. Silence. That man said he was a journalist. But his memory card carried more maps than interviews, more coordinates than quotes, more targets than truth. A tear rolled down the cheek of a woman in the crowd. He did not come to tell our story. He came to steal it. And then, one sentence that would outlive the moment. Don't mistake our silence for blindness. We see you now. That phrase erupted across West Africa. On walls in Bamako, it was painted in red. In WhatsApp bios, it became a digital whisper. We see you now. On TikTok, thousands of videos bore the same echo, dancing not to music, but to memory, protest, and power. And in university halls from Dar es Salaam to Dakar, students chanted it in defiance during morning assemblies. We see you now. The phrase became more than a warning, it became a mirror. Leave a comment if this message echoes your own story. What does sovereignty look like where you live? No other arrests were made. No French citizens were harmed. This wasn't vengeance. This was message, not war. Proof, not propaganda. President Traoré had done something few leaders ever managed. He exposed not just a spy, but a system. A mechanism that had operated for decades under different names: development consultant, NGO liaison, press attaché, cultural envoy. This time, the mask slipped. And the world saw not just a foreign agent caught, but a continent standing taller. By sunset on the fifth day, Morel remained in custody. No more encrypted messages. No more photographs. No more smiles. And he was not the only one in the frame anymore. Now, the entire continent was. And the world was watching. In the early hours of morning, when the city still whispered in sleep and the minarets began their call to prayer, a rusted pickup truck rumbled down the red dirt road leading from Wagadugu toward the secure compound outside Tangin. In the back sat a man once armed with stories. Now, he sat with none. Julian Morel's wrists weren't shackled, but his silence had become its own kind of prison. He stared at his hands, steady, pale, the same hands that once adjusted camera lenses, typed secret memos, and traced the paths of nations he thought too blind to notice. The guards flanking him said nothing. No orders. No intimidation. Just presence. Sometimes, that's all a nation needs. The truck passed a mural freshly painted on a compound wall, an image of President Ibrahim Traoré standing before a microphone, one hand raised, and behind him a map of Africa in full color. Below the mural were 3 words, sprayed in black. Africa has eyes. If you believe it's time for Africa to see itself with clarity and pride, share this message now. Our future begins with our own vision. At the compound, Julian was processed not as a journalist, not even as a diplomat. He was entered into the system as a security threat, code, level 4, foreign operative. That label hadn't been used in years. And not since a time when Burkina Faso was still called Upper Volta, when intelligence was a privilege of outside powers, and surveillance was done to the people, not by them. But things had changed. Traoré hadn't just trained soldiers. He had trained minds. He had sown in the hearts of youth the idea that security wasn't just bullets and bunkers. It was awareness, autonomy, and information warfare. Morel had underestimated them all. While the French embassy requested access and released carefully curated press briefings, the streets of Africa spoke louder. In Kumasi, a high school teacher played the press conference in her civics class. She paused after the first clip. "Do you see the difference?" she asked. "They used to ask us what we wanted. Now they watch to make sure we don't get it." In Conakry, a cafe replayed the video every hour. Men sat drinking tea, debating not if Morel was guilty, but how many had come before him unnoticed. In Nairobi, a professor of international relations gave a lecture titled, "The Camera as Colonizer, Soft Power and Surveillance in Africa." In Johannesburg, protest posters were pasted on train station walls reading, "No more silent lenses." It was no longer just about Julian Morel. It never had been. Back in Wagadugu, inside the president's residence, Traoré sat in a quiet meeting with his closest advisors, security, intelligence, communications, and a new voice, a 29-year-old journalist named Nadia Ouedraogo. She had been one of the 6 local reporters in the press room. She had not spoken during the confrontation. But afterward, she published a 5-paragraph editorial titled, "Not Our Story to Steal." It went viral. Her words were clear, sharp, unapologetic. This was never about one man and his camera. It's about the right to our own story, the right to define our pain, and the right to protect our potential. Now, she sat with the president, notebook open, pen poised. She wasn't there to transcribe power. She was there to challenge it. Traoré looked at her and said, "What would you have asked him?" Nadia didn't flinch. "I would have asked who sent him, and why they thought we wouldn't notice." Traoré smiled, brief, faint, but real. "That's the question I still want answered." And then, quietly, he handed her the printed transcript of Morel's communications. "Read it," he said, "and tell it right. Not as propaganda. As a warning. Not just to them. To us." In those encrypted messages, something deeper emerged. Morel wasn't working alone. Several entries referenced asset stability in Wagadugu, local collaborators in Bobo Dioulasso, and positive rapport with cultural attaches in regional outposts. The emails weren't just about surveillance. They were about relationships, about infiltration, about manufacturing consent through soft cultural presence. One thread described a planned documentary festival to be launched in 2026, funded through a Paris-based development group, but internally coded as Narrative Realignment Initiative. Another referenced identifying outspoken youth leaders for overseas training, eventual field support roles. Traoré closed the folder and sat back in his chair. "They don't send armies anymore," he said. "They send opportunity, with terms and cameras attached." By the 7th day, Julian Morel's story had transformed again. In France, journalists began to ask quiet questions. Why had there been no official assignment? Why did Morel's press credentials trace back to an agency shuttered 4 years prior? Why did embassy staff refer to him as consultant in internal memos, not reporter? The French government tightened its lips. Their initial strategy, discredit, deflect, delay, was beginning to buckle. And inside Burkina Faso, the response was spreading. In Zinière, local theater groups staged reenactments of the confrontation. In Bamako, music artists dropped protest verses, sampling Traoré's words. "You came for stories. Now you are the story." In Cotonou, students printed T-shirts that read, "We see you now." Traoré, for his part, stayed off camera. But his message lived in every mural, every song, every whispered retelling of that moment. He knew the danger wasn't over. Morel was one man. A symptom. The disease was older. More invisible. A network of influence masquerading as aid. A blueprint of control draped in cooperation. He had exposed one, there were many more. He gathered his team again. This time, the meeting included linguists, behavioral analysts, and grassroots organizers. His mission was clear. No more passive surveillance. From now on, we don't just observe, we counter-narrate. He launched an initiative called Mirror Eyes, a network of young documentarians trained not just to film, but to decode, to see beyond what was said and notice what wasn't. Funded locally. Distributed digitally. Uncensored. Unbought. The camera would still roll, but this time in African hands. The final report on Morel's case, delivered privately to Traoré, ended with a single phrase. Operative compromised by overconfidence. Did not anticipate institutional cohesion. Underestimated national awareness. Recommended strategic reassessment. Traoré read it twice. Then, he handed it to Nadia. "Make sure this is archived," he said. "And make sure our children read it one day, not with fear, but with pride. If you're still here, tell us where you're listening from. Every voice matters in this movement of awareness." Later that week, without press or ceremony, Traoré visited a rural school in Tenkedogo. He sat on a low wooden bench with children around him, dusty feet, curious eyes. One child raised a hand. "Is it true he came with a camera to steal our secrets?" Traoré smiled. "Yes," he said. "But it's not the camera that's dangerous. It's the lie it carries." Another asked, "What happens now?" And Traoré replied, not as a president, but as a father, a brother, a citizen. "Now, we learn to tell our own stories. Not because they are perfect, but because they are ours." Even the wind in Wagadugu seemed to shift in those days, moving not with haste, but with purpose. The capital felt alert. Not restless. Not afraid. Just awake. On the 8th day since the arrest of Julian Morel, a quiet tension settled over the streets like morning fog. Traffic moved a little slower. Radios played a little softer. Conversations bent low, careful. Not out of fear, but focus. Because the question had changed. No longer, did he spy? But, who else is watching? In embassies and NGO offices tucked behind shaded courtyards, whispers grew. French nationals began recalibrating, some in defense, others in denial. The journalist had become a mirror. And in his reflection, too many saw traces of themselves. The project consultant collecting community insights, the development attaché with unexplained tech equipment, the cultural envoy cataloging infrastructure for reports. Traoré had lit a match, and shadows began to tremble. If this part of the story speaks to you, send it to someone whose silence has lasted too long. This is how the tide turns, one truth at a time. But while embassies stiffened and think tanks released sterile responses, something very different stirred in the streets of West Africa. In Lomé, a poet read on a sidewalk stage. "We fed them tea, and they fed us theories. We shared our salt, they measured our roads. They watched us dream, and called it data." In Niamey, university students launched a digital archive. Operation Mirage. It collected stories of foreign engagement masked as aid, GPS-linked, time-stamped, cross-referenced with open intelligence. A continent writing its own intelligence dossier. In Banjul, a mural appeared on the wall of a youth center, a child with a camera for an eye, painted in Pan-African colors. Above the lens, it read, "Record us, and we'll remember you." Meanwhile, Julian Morel remained behind secure compound walls. But he was no longer the center of the narrative. He had become the symbol, not the threat. The real work was happening in the spaces between headlines, the classrooms, the border posts, the IT labs, the tea houses, where people asked themselves the deeper question: how long have we mistaken their study of us for respect? And more importantly, how do we study ourselves? President Traoré knew that espionage was just one head of a larger beast. So while Morel waited in silence for a legal process he no longer controlled, Traoré moved to secure the arteries of the nation's future. On the 9th day, he convened a meeting not of ministers, but of farmers, engineers, teachers, and 2 former street vendors. The agenda was blunt. How do we defend our stories? Not our borders. Not just our minerals. Our narrative. One woman, an educator from Wagadugu, spoke plainly. Our children recite dates from European books. They memorize kings they've never seen. We teach them to speak well, but not to speak truth. Another, a telecom engineer, added, "Our networks depend on satellites we don't own. Our information travels across oceans before reaching the next city. We are sovereign on paper, but in practice, we are traced." There were no outbursts. No long speeches. Just clarity. The president nodded. Then it's time we build differently. That afternoon, the Traoré Doctrine was drafted, not a manifesto, but a memo. 4 pages. Straightforward. Urgent. Its core principles. Cultural autonomy is national security. A people who don't control their stories cannot control their future. Infrastructure is not neutral. Foreign-built roads that lead only to mines are not gifts, they are veins to be tapped. Education must decolonize or degrade. Curriculum must reflect not just survival, but sovereignty. Technology must be indigenous or inspected. Any system not understood is a system owned by someone else. By the 10th day, that memo leaked, intentionally. And it ignited like oil on fire. In Dakar, a panel of Pan-African scholars hosted a live-stream breakdown of each line. In Addis Ababa, activists petitioned the AU to adopt it as a continental working draft. In Lusaka, artists painted its 4 tenets on public walls, in French, English, and Nyanja. Traoré had not planned a movement. But he had spoken into the silence. And Africa answered. If this feels like a moment you've waited for, comment, we hear you. We read every voice. This movement isn't led by one man. It lives in many. And still, no word from Julian Morel. Not a denial. Not an admission. Only a single request, sent through diplomatic channels, written in ink, not email. I wish to speak. On record. With President Traoré. No deal was made. No threats exchanged. Traoré accepted. But he set the terms. No cameras. No spin. Just truth. And so, on the 11th day, the 2 men met again. This time, in a room without microphones. Just a low wooden table, 1 guard at the door, and a recorder sealed by the Burkinabe Ministry of Justice. Julian was thinner now. Not sickly, just stripped of the armor he once wore so easily, entitlement. He opened with no pleasantries. I thought you'd deport me, he said. Traoré folded his hands. We don't outsource justice. A long pause. Morel inhaled. I wasn't the first. I know. There are others. Embedded deeper. NGOs. Peacekeepers. Even artists. I know that too. Another pause. Julian leaned forward, eyes hollow. They told us Africa wouldn't notice. Traoré leaned back. They were wrong. The recorder clicked softly. That conversation would remain sealed, officially. But its impact, immediate. Within 48 hours, 5 more foreign operatives were quietly extracted from Burkina Faso, flagged for surveillance violations. 3 had never claimed to be journalists. 1 ran a youth empowerment podcast. The era of invisibility was over. Outside the compound, life continued. Markets opened. Drums played. Young lovers strolled under shade trees. But something had changed, not in activity, but in posture. Africa was sitting up straighter. In Lagos, a filmmaker announced a new project. The Frame Fights Back. In Kampala, a student wrote in chalk on her school wall. Our silence was polite, not permission. In Zanzibar, elders held a gathering, not to protest, but to remember. Because memory, too, is a weapon. As the sun set on the 12th day, President Traoré sat again in that school courtyard. No podium, no media. Just people. He spoke not of Julian Morel, not of France, not of intelligence reports. He spoke of the land, the sky, the people. And then he said, they taught us how to hold a camera. Now we know how to aim it back. This time, not to study them, but to study ourselves. To see, to remember, to rebuild. The crowd stood in silence. Not mourning, not shock, reckoning. And in that stillness, something ancient and new stirred, a murmur older than empires, louder than satellites. We see you now. The dust had settled, but the air remained electric. Few days after the unmasking of Julian Morel, Burkina Faso was not the same country it had been before his arrival. Neither was West Africa. Not because of a war. Not because of a speech. But because of something more enduring. Exposure. A man came with a camera, but he left with his narrative in shreds. What he meant to film as a foreign observer became his own televised downfall, cut not by propaganda, but by evidence. And in doing so, he triggered not just a national moment, but a continental awakening. If you followed this story to this point, you already know, this isn't just news. It's history. Share it now, because someone else is still in the dark. Across the continent, new phrases entered the language of resistance. In Accra, school children began reciting, "We see you now," after morning prayers. In Mombasa, fishermen painted it on their boats, next to saints and slogans. In Libreville, a youth collective renamed their podcast, "Eyes Open." And in Abidjan, where Julian's encrypted servers once pulsed quietly in a rented back office, a different kind of pulsing began. Civil society watchdogs, student coalitions, and investigative reporters cross-linking cases, names, files. The continent wasn't just reacting. It was reorganizing. In Wagadugu, President Ibrahim Traoré refused to claim victory. He did not declare war against foreign powers. He did not gloat. He simply spoke to the people again. No cameras. No flags. Just a simple town hall in a farming district where elders sat on wooden stools and young men leaned against motorbikes. He wore the same fatigues. He used the same words. They watched us through their cameras. But they forgot we were watching too. We don't hate the world. We just remember who we are. A grandmother in the crowd wept quietly, not because she was sad, but because the dignity she had long buried beneath silence had finally spoken. In a closed-door meeting, the African Union Security Council requested a confidential debriefing. Traoré sent not a diplomat, but a teacher and a civil engineer. They carried no slides, no politics, only a printed folder titled, "Surveillance and Sovereignty, a Community Defense Model." Back in France, the fallout deepened. While official statements remained sterile, domestic journalists began to push back. Le Monde published a quiet exposé. Shadows in the Sahel, who authorized Morel? Opposition politicians demanded an inquiry, not because of moral outrage, but because the intelligence failure had embarrassed the Republic. In elite circles, the conversation turned. Is the old model still working? Can we still monitor without mirrors? Has Africa become uncontrollable? The answer, echoing from villages and cities alike, was simple. Not uncontrollable. Just awake. As for Julien Morel, his name faded quickly. He was transferred to a military tribunal under international oversight. Not to make a spectacle of him, but to honor the law, even when others had not. He was not tortured. He was not paraded. He was simply seen. And in that, he experienced what Africa had endured for decades, being watched, evaluated, measured without consent. A single moment of total exposure. Then silence. The camera, once an extension of power, had become a mirror. And from that reflection, a message had emerged. This is not the Africa of pity. Not the Africa of waiting. Not the Africa of dependency, of donor reports, of polite submission. This was a continent with teeth, and memory, and pride, and plans of its own. If this story has stirred something in you, comment below. Share your truth. Your voice is not small. It's part of something larger than any screen. In the weeks that followed, President Traoré did what revolutionaries rarely do. He stepped back from the spotlight. He returned to his work in the field, meeting engineers, signing off on infrastructure, walking markets with no cameras behind him. And while the West debated his intentions, his people understood his impact. In a remote village near Dori, a boy stood at the chalkboard in a community school. He had never seen Paris. He had never held a smartphone. But he had watched the footage, once, projected on a bedsheet by traveling youth organizers. He picked up the chalk and wrote, slowly, as the class watched. "Don't mistake our silence for blindness." The teacher paused, then nodded. "Again," she said. And the children repeated it like a prayer. In a region where memory has always been oral, this moment etched itself in skin, in speech, in silence. Julien Morel had come to tell a story. Instead, he became one. A cautionary tale. A catalyst. A confession no one asked for, but everyone understood. And so it ended. No gunfire. No headlines screaming from rooftops. Just a whisper turned into a wave. A lens turned inward. And a continent no longer willing to blink. If this story belongs to you, tell it. If it reminds you of something buried deep, dig it up. Speak. Paint. Write. March. Film. Remember. Because this time, Africa didn't stay quiet. This time, Africa saw. And this time, Africa responded.